From APM, American Public Media.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. The law offices of Phillips, Hunt & Walker proudly support WJCT. Personal injury, criminal defense, and family law. Phillips, Hunt & Walker, committed to justice. 904-444-4444 or floridajustice.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, Florida doubles down on non-compete agreements, bucking a national trend towards more employee rights. We ask an attorney to explain how it could impact your next job hunt. Then, if you think grocery bills are high now, buckle up. A new Florida TaxWatch report predicts tariffs may soon push them up another 10 to 15%. We talked to the report's author about the findings. And actor Edward James Olmos called it the best film he'd ever been a part of. We preview a joint screening by WJCT and the Cummer Museum of the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Giles Snyder. Authorities in the Boston area investigating the cause of a deadly fire last night at an assisted living facility. At least 9 people were killed at the Gabriel House in Fall River and some 30 others injured, including several firefighters. Fall River Fire Chief Jeffrey Bacon says dozens of firefighters responded, many of them off duty.
Crews were met with heavy fire coming through the main entrance and multiple people hanging out the windows looking to be rescued.
Officials say some 70 people lived at Gabriel House. The city has opened a temporary shelter for those displaced. With more rain falling in central Texas, there is concern about more flooding. For now, search efforts have been suspended. More than 160 people remain missing following the 4th of July flooding. At least 132 were killed. NPR's Frank Morris is in hard-hit Kerr County.
Heavy rains Sunday pushed up river levels and temporarily shut down the search for victims of the Independence Day flooding in Texas. The focus switched back to saving lives as first responders rescued at least 24 people near Lampasas, Texas. Search crews are back out today trying to work down a long list of missing people. A list officials admit is imprecise. Progress finding bodies has slowed to a crawl. Volunteers who numbered more than 12,000 last week are starting to ebb away, and victims still out on the river are well hidden. The raging flood mangled large trucks and buried some completely in gravel and debris. Deep water in a reservoir on the river and behind smaller dams is likely concealing more debris and bodies. Frank Morris, NPR News, Kerr County, Texas.
An NPR investigation shows Camp Mystic, the all-girls camp where at least 27 people died following the July 4th flooding, requested that FEMA remove multiple buildings from government flood maps, even though the camp faced a significant flood risk. FEMA documents examined by NPR show FEMA removed the structures in 2013, 2019, and 2020 when the camp undertook a major expansion. Secretary of Homeland Security has been speaking with governors of several states about creating another detention center for those in the U.S. without legal status. It would be similar to the facility in Florida dubbed Alligator Alcatraz. Here's NPR's Mara Eliason.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says there will never be amnesty on President Trump's watch, and Trump himself is telling immigration agents to use whatever means necessary to protect themselves during raids. This after a Los Angeles federal judge issued an order to stop the raids. There's also new polling that shows Trump's immigration policies are broadly unpopular. Majorities of Americans want the border secure and criminals without legal status deported, but they don't like deporting law-abiding immigrants who pick their crops, mow their lawns, and take care of their elderly parents. Mara Liasson, NPR News.
This is NPR.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It is 9:04. Information on the planned redesign of the Brentwood Branch Library will be presented at two meetings tomorrow. Jacksonville Public Library officials will join the redesign architect and others at the information sessions set for 6 p.m. and 6:45 p.m. at the facility on North Pearl Street. Attendees will hear updates on the current development timeline, recent facility assessments, and the next steps in the planning process. Governor Ron DeSantis may have vetoed a lot of local items in this year's budget, but not everything was eliminated. Millions of dollars are headed to the First Coast to expand schools, build roads and bridges, and more. The biggest item, the University of North Florida will receive nearly $15 million to build the Hicks Honors College Center with classrooms, labs, and offices. Jacksonville Classical Academy Pre-K through 12 charter school will get $3 million to expand, and the Museum of Science and History will also get $2.5 million toward its future North Bay campus. The first segment of a corridor to connect I-295 to US 1 in St. Johns County will get started with $6 million. The project is intended to improve traffic and pedestrian safety in that area. You can read more about what is funded for our area in the state budget in the story at jaxtoday.org. Scattered showers and storms for the I-95 corridor starting around the middle of the day, and then showers become more widespread through the afternoon for inland areas. Highs will be in the 90s today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Cy Sims Foundation. Since 1985, supporting advances in science, education, and the arts towards a fairer, more just, and civil society. More information is available at cysimsfoundation.org.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, markets and trading partners react to the president's weekend announcement of 30% tariffs on the European Union and Mexico. We discuss a new Florida TaxWatch report on how the threat and reality of tariffs are already taking hold in the state. But first, it's being called one of the most employer-friendly policies in the United States, and it is now Florida law. Here to tell us what it could mean for your next job search is Zach Roth, attorney with Ansbacher Law, which we should note is also a WJCT underwriter. Zach, good morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So the push elsewhere is to sort of back away from non-competes. Florida is sort of bucking this trend and moving in the opposite direction. Tell us kind of what is happening right now.
Yeah, it was interesting. Last year, the FCC actually put out guidance, rule, whatever you want to say, that non-competes were not enforceable. So we went from this potential, there are no non-competes nationwide, to now in Florida, we are twice as strong if you go from a time period as we were before. A lot of states, I think Virginia is one of them, really are loosening the ability to do non-competes. And Florida said, we're going to go the opposite direction and went a completely different way and put in much stronger non-compete protections for employers, not employees.
And so this new law is called the Florida Contracts Honoring Opportunity, Investment, Confidentiality, and Economic Growth, also known as the Choice Act. And this essentially increases from 2 to 4 years the period that an employer can enforce a non-compete agreement. And we maybe just should kind of remind people what a non-compete provides for.
Yeah, so essentially it means that if you work for me and you have certain skills is really the intent. We could talk about some of the monetary thresholds in that, but if you're a certain skilled person, high level, I can prevent you from going to another business that does something similar for 4 years. And if you think about it, if you're out of the game for 4 years, you're probably out of the game permanently. So it effectively prohibits competition for high level employees.
That's pretty extraordinary. So from 2 to 4 years, and you kind of alluded to this, but this is for high earning employees. And there are thresholds that are set basically who's considered high earning.
Yeah, it has to do based on the county where you're located. And it's essentially double the average salary of your locality. But what's interesting is If you looked at, just take the First Coast, if you looked at the average salary in Duval and compared that to St. John's and Baker, for example, you might have wildly different numbers. And I think the statute was intentionally drafted very vaguely to kind of give some room to play with things. And I think that could be something that you see is where is the business located as a way of changing those thresholds.
Yeah. And I know that, non-competes are broadly used for, kind of people in television, sort of on-screen talent. It's very common for those people to have non-competes. But what other kinds of industries tend to use non-competes?
You'll have it a lot in management staff of a lot of different kinds of businesses. Anything from a swim school to I don't know. It's just really anything. The one place that it is prohibited specifically in the statute is in healthcare, and then another place that it's prohibited under ethics rules, at least has been historically. I guess there's some question of whether it continues to be with the statute is in attorneys. Attorneys can't have non-competes. But I would say other than that, it's pretty broad who takes advantage of them. I run into them quite a bit in various kinds of businesses.
And so you talked about this healthcare worker exemption, and that was something that was sort of inserted into this bill as it was moving through. That is because of a perceived, the importance of healthcare workers in this state and sort of the shortages that we're experiencing and a desire not to hinder that particular line of work.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. And so, but for other workers, sometimes non-competes are seen as really non-competitive. And there has been a lot of pushback in this state from labor activists and people who are kind of advocating for more freedom of innovation, people who advocate for, fields to be able to expand and try new things. And they believe that this is kind of hampers that.
I think that 100% is the case. If you're talking about locking employees in for 4 years, at that point, you are significantly dampening the market for employees because how many are going to be eligible at any given time within a specialized field? If you're looking, let's say, if you got a tier B position, call it, and someone has a non-compete and you're wanting to hire them for a tier A position, that's a promotion for that person. It's not like you're taking them and putting them in the same position, but they're still not going to be able to take it. And so that exactly does what you're mentioning and just tampers down that competition for labor.
And so one of the changes that this law provides for, we were talking a little bit before the show began, is, previously employers had to demonstrate that there was like a legitimate business interest that was in peril, trade secrets, something that they would measurably lose if their non-compete was not enforced. But this law changes kind of the assumption of who is entitled to a non-compete. Can you explain what has changed there?
Yeah, that was the thing that honestly I was most surprised when I first read the bill, because historically in any type of injunctive situation, you have to prove that you're more likely to prevail, and you have to prove a certain interest, irreparable harm, that kind of stuff. And this completely flips that on his head, and it says that if the employer alleges a violation, the court shall enter an injunction. It doesn't even provide for a hearing. It says that it will be done without a hearing, and it is the burden of the employee by clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher standard than we have in civil court generally, to prove a certain limited list of items that they can prove to overturn it.
And so essentially, if an employer seeks this injunctive relief, the court is obligated to issue it. And so that is in effect until what point?
Well, that's a real big concern I have, is because it says shall, which means it's mandatory by interpretation. And it doesn't say then that they shall immediately schedule a hearing. For example, in an eviction, it says that the court will move the matter forward on the docket to move quickly. It doesn't say that about this. So given how busy court calendars are, the court enters an injunction without a hearing, and now I put in my evidence as an employee, and maybe I get a hearing in 3 months, in which time I can't work. Maybe it's 6 months. I don't know. I schedule hearings all the time for routine things, and it's to get 30 minutes. It's 3 months from now. Is 30 minutes long enough to prove something like this? Do you need an hour? Now we're talking 4 months to get a hearing. It's a really interesting aspect of the law that raises a lot of concerns.
Yeah, and things that you think maybe could be challenged somewhere down the road?
Yeah, I have a concern with the idea that the court shall grant an injunction without a hearing, because under just general constitutional due process, the two elements are notice and an opportunity for hearing. You're going to have your notice by the filing, so I think that's going to be met. But if there's no hearing before the injunction is entered and you're taking away that employee's right to work, to me, that is a potential due process issue.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about the impact of Florida's new employer-friendly non-compete law. And if you have questions about how it could impact you, you can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. In just a bit, we're going to break down the costs that Floridians can expect to see from Trump administration tariffs. But for now, we are talking about this new non-compete deal. And one thing that's interesting about it, Zach, is the fact that this became law without the governor's signature, this Choice Act. And that's extremely unusual for this administration. In fact, it's the first time that it's happened. There were 3 bills that became law. This was one of them without his signature. What do we take away from that? Are there political implications as to why that might have happened? Do we know what might be motivating that?
I think that has to be the explanation, right? And, the governor, he knows, okay, I got it in my back pocket. I don't have to sign this and it's going to become law. So if he supports it, but he's got certain groups that he doesn't want, to be upset that he signed it, he can still let it become law without signing it. It's not like the federal government, for example, where if the president doesn't sign it, it's vetoed. Here it becomes law. And so I think it is obviously a political, for some background, I don't know what it is, but the fact that it took him 6 years to do this, I think indicates that there's something unique here, or maybe it's a changing trend. We'll see. I don't know. We'll find out more next year, I guess, when more bills come.
Yeah. We do know that the Choice Act, this was House Bill 1219, was backed by a Republican mega donor, Ken Griffin. He's the hedge fund manager at Citadel, who's donated nearly $50 million to the GOP. It was also supported by Associated Industries of Florida, which is another big lobby group, and sponsored by St. Johns County Senator Tom Lee. So that was kind of the support behind it. I want to ask you a little bit about, deviating from this national trend, because we know that there are a lot of states that are moving in sort of the opposite direction. California, Minnesota, North Dakota, some places have just outright banned non-competes. Places like New York and Illinois have got some income-based restrictions or just sort of other restrictions on it. What is the sense of balancing, legitimate employer interests, the need to protect their trade secrets, the need to protect their client lists from, following another high-level employee out the door?
Well, what's interesting about that is Florida has always had a statute that regulated non-competes. It regulated it differently than we currently have. And I don't recall there being significant concern that it wasn't working. You could put non-competes in that were reasonable based on scope and duration, which is generally, I would say, the historic trend nationally is a reasonableness standard in the court's definition. And maybe there's some guardrails on it. And the way the statute used to work is up to a certain time within this time is reasonable based on the nature of the position and the geographic scope and that kind of thing. And so it is interesting that we kind of had the norm, and a lot of the norm is becoming more restrictive on non-competes, and we kind of threw the norm out the window and went with this very vague, broad statute that, other than the income-based restriction, has almost no guardrails on it.
Something else that's covered by this law, in addition to non-competes, is something that's called garden leave. And that's kind of an interesting arrangement. I think to the ordinary person, it might sound a little cushy. It's basically, if you leave your job, there's this period during which your employer continues to pay you. You continue to get benefits. You can't compete or get another job in that field. But it sort of sounds like a sweet deal, right? And yet there are some other considerations.
Yeah, I think for the people that those garden leave, agreements are going to apply to, a lot of their compensation is going to be made up in ways other than their salary. Bonuses, could be commissions, also things like that. And not to mention just growth over time. So it sounds cushy that you're going to get locked into your salary, but if you're going to go 4 years with no increases in pay, no bonuses, no commissions, whatever it may be, it actually is fairly restrictive on people that otherwise could have significant financial upside.
People who are getting, as you say, bonuses or commissions who suddenly would not get any of that during that period.
And probably no raise for 4 years.
Right. So there have been, some alternatives traditionally to non-compete agreements. There can be sort of non-disclosure agreements, um, intellectual property protections. I mean, can you sort of run through what some of the ways that companies can kind of control whether they're bleeding employees to other competitors besides non-compete?
Yeah, I would say the two big ones are what you mentioned, confidentiality and non-disclosure. Those are kind of two sides of the same coin. And then non-solicitation. So confidentiality and non-disclosure are pretty simple. You can't share things that you learned while you were working with us with someone else and use that against us. And that can be trade secrets, intellectual property, but it could also be broader than that. And a lot of times it's limited to basically everything except what you would learn publicly or that you already knew when you got here.
I mean, why is it that is not sufficient? That something like saying you can't, solicit competitors or you can't disclose, you have this non-disclosure agreement isn't enough, and that this push for the overall non-compete is taking.
I think you could take the position that forces you to live in the gray, because how do I prove what you knew before you got here and what you learned through me? And how do I prove that you could have known it publicly versus not? It's straightforward on the recipe for Coca-Cola, for example, right? That's pretty easy. But in terms of, well, this is the way that you do this thing. This is the easiest way to go about this process. Well, I could say, well, I knew how to do that before I got here. That's why you hired me. And the employer says, no, that's what we teach you. So it kind of removes that gray area of the argument and says, you just can't do it.
And we know that, people who were under an agreement before this law took effect in July, they're not covered by this new act. And so there are people who are still covered by the prior law. And that includes people that we're not talking about, lower wage workers who are governed by this, 2-year. It can be very restrictive on, people who don't work in necessarily super lucrative businesses, people who are like hairdressers,
right? People
who are like personal trainers.
Yeah, it's very broad. I know an example of a personal trainer who, they're working at a large gym. They don't make that much money, has clients that they've met independent of the gym, got fired because they were working outside of that and had to leave their employment. Other than providing the gym access, I'm not sure that they were providing any unique training or skill to that employee that justifies saying you can't do work outside of work.
Yeah, and we talked about the FTC and then also the National Labor Relations Board, pushing for rules that get rid of non-compete deals overall because they're perceived as unfair. And one of the instances that galvanized some of that movement was this Jimmy John's example. That is no longer in effect, but for a long time, until 2016, workers at Jimmy John's had to promise that they wouldn't work at any other sandwich shop within 3 miles, which turned out to be, when you consider every fast food restaurant that sells a sandwich, turned out to cover enormous amounts of territory. And people looked at that and said, we're not talking about trade secrets here. It's a sandwich.
Right. Well, that's something that's interesting because geographic scope is such a huge element of these, right? And 3 miles sounds narrow, but it's not 3 miles on the road. It's draw a circle 3 miles around it. Think about if you were in San Marco and you drew a circle of 3 miles around, you're going to capture a lot of places. Say you're in Jack's Beach, you're going to capture a lot of places. And historically, there's been kind of guardrails, I've used that term a couple times, on geographic scope. But the new statute basically says within a geographic scope identified in the agreement and doesn't say anything about how you put guardrails on that geographic scope.
And so there's not any limit as far as we know on kind of the range that they can claim. I mean, because some businesses, they could say, even if you're based in Florida, that there are competitors all over the place.
I think that's what you're going to end up seeing happen, which is, interesting. Say I work for, we'll use the personal trainer example since we used it. If you're working as a personal trainer in Jacksonville and you move to Charlotte, are you really competing? But the statute doesn't restrict it because it just says within a geographic scope contained in the agreement.
So there are people, as we said, who believe that this is anti-innovation, it, is anti-startup, even anti-worker. But I would guess that there's some people, and certainly, the lobbying behind it would suggest people who think that this will help businesses in Florida succeed in some respect. And I wonder if businesses might be persuaded to, for instance, relocate to Florida because these are such favorable employee favorable laws.
Well, because there are significant costs to businesses to recruiting and training employees. And so as someone that experiences that, myself, it's hard when you spend a lot of time training someone, invest in them, and then you train them up and then they get poached away. And so that is a legitimate business interest to regulate. And I do think it's going to be desirable that's going to be something that can be protected in Florida. What's going to be interesting to see is if, in a way, this sparks competition in the non-compete market, if that makes any sense. Because if I'm looking at two businesses, one has a non-compete and one doesn't, and I'm considering where to take a job, if I'm the employee, that's probably a pretty easy decision for me if everything else is equal. So it's going to be interesting how that works. And also, because of these monetary thresholds in the statute, it's going to be interesting because it could result in some people actually getting pay bumps for the purpose of in putting a non-compete in place.
Yeah,
So
explain how that could work. I mean, we said that there's these county by county income thresholds. And so explain what you mean by a bump.
yeah, so let's say you're making 45%, or I guess because it's double, so let's call it 190% of the local average salary. Well, I'm going to the point where I want to give you a raise, and instead of giving you X, which would put you at 198%, I'm going to give you X plus 3%, but I want you to sign a new agreement with me, and it's got a non-compete in it. At the 198%, I couldn't do it, but at the 201, I could. And so maybe employers will start to buy non-competes with a little bit of extra increase. It's going to be interesting to see if there's that, I don't want to use the term manipulation, but if there's that trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, there might be an incentive to give a little raise just to kind of put the handcuffs on an employee and prevent that. Departure. So you're an attorney. I guess the question is sort of, what would you, broadly speaking, advise if people are either in this situation or possibly, as you say, facing a circumstance where they might be offered a small increase in order to put them within the threshold of what this law governs?
Well, generally speaking, as an attorney, I always say you should talk to an attorney. Right? I'm never going to tell anyone you shouldn't talk to an attorney. But this is interesting because when it's a brand new law, and it's not just a new law, we have changes to the law every year, but this is a completely new structure. So other than what we have in the statute right now, we don't know how courts are going to interpret this statute and start to implement it. So you're going to go talk to an attorney, and an attorney's probably going to tell you, we are not sure yet. These are the 1, 2, 3 things that are very black and white in the statute. Outside of that, we don't know what the courts are going to say. And so right now, because you're locking yourself in for 4 years, I guess the best advice is you just need to be very, very aware of what you're signing and very comfortable with it before you do it, because you're signing into such a new program.
And if, in fact, this law is somewhat unconstitutional based on what you said in terms of not having the due process, measurement or measures built in, that's not something a judge just sitting on the case would determine, right? That would have to be specifically challenged through a court procedure by someone who's impacted by the law.
Yeah, and I don't know if a case has been filed yet. My assumption is there's already been a case filed to challenge the constitutionality of it. That's the way it typically goes. But yes, it's not going to just be something the court's going to say, I'm not going to do this because I think I have a problem with this, without the person at least raising it. Generally speaking, courts, because you're going to be in a trial court here, trial courts don't like to make constitutional law normally. They like to decide based on the law before them. If they tried to apply a constitutional analysis to every single case before them, nothing would ever happen in their cases. And so trial courts really aren't given the tools to do that. And so just with your run-of-the-mill case, they're probably going to comply with the statute until they're told not to.
All right. Well, Attorney Zach Roth, it's nice to have you back. Thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Up next, bracing for a grocery bill hike. We discuss a new report that tariffs could soon push them up another 10 to 15%. Welcome back. Surging consumer prices and higher operating costs for businesses are among the outcomes predicted by a new state report on proposed Trump administration import taxes. Florida TaxWatch is a nonpartisan nonprofit government watchdog that has researched tax issues in the state for 45 years. Joining us by phone to tell us about the new findings is Julie Shaw. She's a research economist at Florida TaxWatch and author of the new report. Good morning, Julie. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So this report is called The Potential Impacts of New Tariffs on Florida's Economy. And we know that there has been a lot of confusion surrounding these tariffs, in some cases more confusion than comprehension. But you're trying to look at how this will impact Florida consumers, Florida businesses, and really the overall economy of the state. What is the takeaway there?
Well, Florida is the 10th largest importer in the U.S. We imported a value of about $117 billion in 2024. And even in January 2025, Florida exported goods worth $6.1 billion and imported goods worth $10 billion. So we're importing more than we're exporting. And it mostly comes from industries that are from the vehicle manufacturing, electronic industries, and the industrial machineries, which means that we lack the facilities right now to kind of make those goods from Florida. So importing goods will probably raise costs more when tariffs are imposed. Right now, they're on a halt till August 1st, as we all know.
Right. And one particularly eye-catching finding of this report is that grocery bills could increase by 10 to 15% if these new tariffs are imposed. And that is on top of a 25% increase that Florida has seen since the start of the pandemic, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we're talking about a really significant, potentially significant impact on people's pocketbooks.
Yeah. So Florida is already one of the highest states that pays like more for their groceries. And seeing an impose on tariffs, it's just because we also import a lot of some kinds of seafood, fruits, nuts. So seeing that as though families use those in their regular grocery bills, weekly bills will most probably go up 10 to 15%. That's from a study that the Capitol Hill did.
So are these increased costs unavoidable? I mean, we know that there's this pullback, sort of a moniker that's been applied to the path of these tariffs is TACO, which stands for Trump always chickens out. It's kind of a term coined by a reporter, but basically indicating that there's this, declaration that there's going to be these tariffs, and then there are delays in their imposition. But it does seem that certainly we know some have been imposed and others seem to be really moving forward.
Yeah, so it's more of a negotiating game that President Trump is playing, which most countries tend to do because a lot of countries do impose tariffs on American products that haven't been reduced in many years. So what we're trying to do is kind of level the playing field and increase also our value in their international trade market and try to boost American domestic manufacturing so that in the long term, we can have products that are already made within the country so we don't have to depend on other countries for the value of our products being sold to consumers.
And so for a state like Florida, where you say, we really are import heavy and we don't have that manufacturing base, what would be the forecast for those tariffs having that kind of impact in Florida, or at least on what timeline?
It really depends on when those trade negotiations are finished. But I think in the short term, what we've seen in research is that in the short term, prices will most definitely increase because we'll see a lot of imports, for example, in the construction industry, where we depend on a lot for raw materials from Mexico or Canada. And before we can start manufacturing those products and raw materials in Florida, we're still going to have to depend on these countries for importing the raw materials. So if cost of production goes up for the businesses, in order to maintain a profit margin, those costs are also burdened on the consumers as well as the businesses. It's not just the consumers that pay for these tariffs.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about the financial impacts Floridians can expect from Trump administration import taxes. You can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Julie, this report is based on U.S. Imposed tariffs or proposed tariffs, I should say, not necessarily on retaliatory tariffs, I guess. And can you kind of explain, first of all, how you're deciding what set of facts to apply to your analysis in an environment where the numbers seem to be changing day by day, practically?
Yeah. So there are a lot of institutions that do studies like the Tax Foundation and then the budget model at Yale and the budget model at Penn Wharton that consistently try to calculate what kind of costs will be borne by consumers on a number of tariffs. Right now, we can see that there is a pause on the tariffs, which hopefully trade negotiations will come to an end on August 1st, and we'll see something kind of definite more to go towards. But tariffs can also bring a revenue to the national economy and also the state economy, and we have seen that in the past month. I believe that we've been in a budget surplus federally, which not a lot of people saw coming. But we kind of decided to stick to just proposed imposing tariffs that America is going to do on other countries, because reciprocal tariffs can be seen in the future. While negotiations are going on, one country might say, okay, if you do this, we're going to place a 10% tariff on American products. But then we go back with another number that let's come somewhere in the middle where we can kind of have the same playing field for both countries, and both of the countries can make a good process of it.
Right, but I mean, even the tariffs that have been proposed appear to change, frequently, and we know that this report that you issued came out the same week that the president announced a 25% tax on Japan and South Korean imports just this weekend. Despite a lot of negotiations that have been happening with Mexico and the European Union, he announced 30% tariffs and 50% tariffs on Brazil, just sort of out of a political peak. So when you're making these calculations, are you saying, that this is the moment in time that they immortalize? And kind of when is that? Has that changed since the report came out?
I'm sure some of the calculations would have definitely changed after the report came out, because this report kind of focuses mainly on the 10% tariffs that are proposed to be on almost all the countries worldwide. So the calculations from this report are only on those tariffs, on the 10% universal tariffs that we're planning to impose.
I see. So if this is based on the 10% universal tariffs, what could we expect if these more dramatic tariffs take effect? Is everything in your report just amplified, or do the findings change?
It kind of goes both ways, because when those tariffs are imposed, we also make a revenue out of them federally. So our federal revenue can also go up because of those imposed tariffs. But in the short term, I think that definitely the costs borne by both businesses and consumers would go up.
So I know that, there were very dire predictions initially when these were announced, and everybody was saying that inflation was going to go up. I think that that has happened to a lesser degree than people were predicting or fearing. And the administration has sort of claimed that that's, a measure of the fact that these costs are ultimately going to be borne by somebody other than consumers, that the nations that are exporting these goods are going to bear those costs, or the middlemen are going to absorb them somehow. What do you think about the pace of inflation, and, whether that is an eventuality that is certain, or whether maybe that just won't happen?
Looking at the trend right now, inflation has been pretty steady. It hasn't gone up like a lot of people, like you said, have had predicted. But with that, we can always compare, production pricing or personal purchasing power, what kind of all income level, people at all income levels will probably feel these effects. But that would be in the short term. Like I said, it wouldn't, I don't think that in the long term we'll see that much of a hike in inflation in the coming months, just because there's still so many negotiations going on. It's still very uncertain in the broader economic outlook. And I think before any actual calculation can be made, we have to wait for, final decisions on trade negotiations.
It seems, too, that among economists, there's question about what price increases or decreases might actually signify. For instance, the cost of eggs or airfares, have seen actually some measurable decline. But some are saying that might actually be a sign of a weakening economy as opposed to just a relief from inflation. Can you explain kind of what those two things might indicate?
Yeah, so whenever inflation goes up, we see federal rates trying to mobilize that inflation. And mobilizing federal rates is always a little tough to anticipate what effect that can have. Now, that can have an effect of weakening the economy, or it can have an effect of kind of boosting savings in the U.S., which can lead to, in the longer term, people spending more after a few months or maybe next year when employment is also higher and inflation is lower, and people are going to start spending their money again.
So we know that
it kind of can go.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Julie.
No,
Go ahead.
sorry. No, I was just saying it can possibly go both ways, but trying to anticipate it kind of also depends on how the federal rates are controlled.
And this is a statewide study that Florida TaxWatch did, obviously, but I'm just curious if there are regional anomalies that we should be thinking about. I know that here, the University of North Florida's Jacksonville Economic Monitoring Survey, which does, these kind of analysis frequently, if not monthly, they have found contraction in virtually every sector when it comes to, key indicators that they track, whether it's production output or new orders or work backlogs, and even employment. And so this is now the fifth straight month of local manufacturing contraction. Do we know how the trends that you're forecasting based on these tariffs could impact different regions differently?
I did not say that much on the regional level, but I can say that definitely it can make a difference regionally, because a lot of for example, the citrus industry in Florida is based regionally more in Central Florida than it is anywhere else. Now, the citrus industry is already struggling a little bit since the past few years. With reciprocal tariffs possibly in place from places like Canada and Mexico, where we export our orange juice, where we export our oranges, that will have likely a negative impact on the citrus industry more than it already is having. So that would affect the Central Florida region more than it would affect North Florida or South Florida. Same with the tourism industry in South Florida and parts of the IT industry that we see towards Tampa. So it can go industry-wise based on where those industries are focused in Florida. But on what level, I am not sure at this point.
Yeah, and it's surprising to see. I mean, you say that there are industries that are going to be more heavily impacted, and your report specifically highlights construction, car, purchases, automotive dealerships, and then a couple that surprised me. One was fish, seafood, which you think of, on this peninsula and with all of our waterways that we would be exporting more than we're importing. But in fact, we are really heavily dependent on seafood imports.
Yeah, we are in the fisheries industry just because we have so much demand. People in Florida love fishing, love eating fish. Seafood is very popular here. Just to maintain that demand and supply, we do have to import a lot of our seafood products as well.
Well, it is a very interesting report, timely and helpful, and we thank you so much for coming on to talk about it. This is a report that's available, if you want to look it up, at floridataxwatch.org. And we're talking to the author of the report, Julie Shaw. Thank you, Julie. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
All right. Up next, a special local screening of a landmark of Chicano cinema. Welcome back. Actor Edward James Olmos called it the best film he'd ever been a part of, but it's a lesser-known classic and the subject of a rare local screening this week by WJCT and the Cummer Museum. Here to tell us about it, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, is Holly Karras. She's the chief curator at the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens. Good morning. Welcome back, Holly.
Good morning.
We're also joined by David McGowan, president and CEO of WJCT Public Media. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Ann.
So this is an old and really little-known film, Holly. I wonder if you could tell us kind of where the idea to revive it came from.
Sure. We've got an exhibition up right now at the Cummer Museum that is called Knowing the West. And it's all about breaking down kind of the myth of the American West. Many people think they know the West because they've seen movies, they've read about it in books, but that's not the full story of the West. So when the opportunity came to present a film in conjunction with the exhibition, I was looking for something that really hit on that kernel of how do we really understand the American West. And this movie asks us to step back from our own experiences and consider the experiences of others. So it was really a perfect fit.
And it's interesting because you mentioned movies, and certainly like Westerns are one way that we have traditionally seen and interpreted the West through Hollywood. And the fact that this is a film, but also a film that represents kind of this movement in Chicano cinema, is a very different lens through which to view the West.
It is, yes. There were so many people who make up the West, so many different cultures, so many different languages, so many different identities, that I think what has happened in many respects is it's been reduced to a single narrative or a single voice. And both the exhibition and this film really seek to just bust out of that narrow lens.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the movie itself and Chicano cinema in a minute. But David, I want to bring you into this conversation because this is a new kind of partnership that WJCT is doing with the Cummer. We've been doing this film series, trying to kind of pick up the vacuum that was left when Sunrise Cinema closed. But this is a little bit of a movement even beyond just screening films.
It is, but a lot of what we do here at WJCT Public Media, as your listeners, I think, know, is really seek to amplify the work of the other cultural institutions here in town. And we've had projects ongoing with MOSH, with the World Affairs Council. We've done a screening with them. And so this is really an opportunity to use the film series to do exactly that here, to help us to amplify the work that the Cummer has done in putting on this exhibition on the West. The film series, as you know, has been a tremendous success. People are really enthusiastic about it, very encouraging, and attendance has been great. And so this is just a way to, again, extend that mission of amplifying the work of our cultural peers, through all the services that we offer.
And so how did those conversations start? I mean, I know that you guys survey people who come to these screenings to see, preferences, experiences, but how do you determine that, a partnership might be a good vehicle to screen a film?
We just talk to each other all the time. I mean, all the museums and the symphony and the Florida Theater, I mean, we get together regularly and we talk about what we're doing, and we sometimes hit on a spark and say, hey, this would be a great opportunity to do something together in this space. And so that's literally what happened here. We've had, longstanding ties with the Cummer and been talking to them about a lot of things. And this was just an opportunity that we saw to work together. And so here we go.
Yeah. And so this is a film from 1982, though, and I'm sort of curious how it percolated to the surface. Who had heard of it? Who knew to show it?
Well, so the Knowing the West exhibition is on loan to us from the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. And so I reached out to the curatorial team there and said, did you all have any discussions about showing films in conjunction with the exhibition? And they hadn't, but they sent me to the Criterion website, and I started going through films on Criterion, and I came across this one and started reading some of the articles, both in the moment about the film and then some later kind of, reevaluations of it. And I thought, this is what we're looking for.
That's a great work that your curators are doing behind the scenes to find some additional content. We're going to have to take a short break. We're going to come back on the other side of the break and talk a little bit more about the film, its elements, and why people and where people, in fact, can see it and when. We'll be back in just a minute.
Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. When people are hurt through no fault of their own, finding the who, what, when, where, why, and how that led to the accident is critical to proving the truth.
More at TerrellHoganLaw.com. Mayo Clinic, working to fix the unfixable by combining robotics and an endoscope to perform spinal fusion surgeries more safely and effectively. More at mayoclinic.org/Florida.
On the next Fresh Air, life as a jailhouse lawyer. While serving a life sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola for a murder he didn't commit, Calvin Duncan studied law and helped free many wrongfully convicted prisoners, including himself. He's since been exonerated and received a law degree. He continues to do legal work with prisoners. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Marine biologist Jasmine Graham grew up in a fishing family speaking Creole dialect in South Carolina's Low Country. Then she fell in love with sharks.
I was particularly interested in just like the wild and wacky adaptations that sharks have, hammerheads, sawfish, anything that you look at it and you go, why do you look like that?
That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
On July 4th next year, our nation celebrates the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. How has our national identity changed since the founding of the country, and what do we still have to learn? Looking at 250 years of American innovation and how it's shaped the country today. That's next time on 1A.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I'm speaking with the Cummers Chief Curator, Holly Karras, and WJCT CEO, David McGowan, about a joint screening this Wednesday of the Western, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, here at WJCT. So we were talking during the break a little bit, Holly, about kind of the way this film is presented, and it is designed to sort of, expand the way that we think about the characters in the film. The story is sort of based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The central character in this is kills a sheriff essentially due to a misunderstanding in defense of his own life. But it's all kind of based on a language barrier, and the film sort of grabs that and offers the audience like a way into understanding that through the way that it tells the story.
That's exactly right. This is based on a true story, and this is how it unfolded based on a language barrier at a time. This happens to have taken place in Texas when the southern border was exceptionally fluid. There were many people who spoke different languages, and as a result of this misunderstanding, a sheriff's officer gets killed, other people get killed, and they go on a manhunt for the man that they think is responsible, who is Gregorio Cortez. And the filmmakers set this up so the audience is trying to unravel all of the things that are going on because these people aren't speaking the same languages. And it's not until the end of the movie where you really get to see the film and the episode from both perspectives.
And so while there's the kind of messages in this movie, it is also just a thrilling kind of Western in the sense that there are these, there's this manhunt, which really did happen.
Which really happened. And there, the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez is, this whole episode, not only in the film, but has been passed down in song. And it's something that is well known to many people, not widely across the United States. And so you think this one thing started from one very simple misunderstanding, and thousands of men got involved in this manhunt. I mean, this was not 20 guys going into Mexico going after one guy. It was a huge, a press moment of its own time, and it all just got so horribly blown out of proportion.
And so hundreds of Texas Rangers in pursuit, and we were seeing, for people who are watching on our live stream, a lot, as you say, tons of articles about this at the time. This was heavily covered by the news,
Mm-hmm.
and has gone on to become the subject of folk songs and, sort of a piece of lore that is well known in Mexico.
In Mexico in certain circles, and certainly has incredible contemporary relevance today as well.
So we mentioned the Chicano cinema movement, and that's something that kind of started in the 50s and then kind of got a boost in the 70s. But essentially, I mean, you can probably better explain it, but it's something that, tried to normalize Spanish in American films and kind of depict institutional racism. So it was, exposing a lot of people in the U.S. for the first time to a different worldview, which does sort of go hand in hand with the exhibit.
And centering, a non-white narrative,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that's an incredibly important aspect of both this film and the exhibition that we have at the museum.
Yeah, and so how has it been received? The exhibition.
The exhibition has been so well received. I think it does what it starts off to do. So many people do feel like they have an intimate understanding of the West, not just people in America, but as you say, Hollywood, movies, books, TV shows. It has created a mythology, and when people come into the exhibition and they see the dozens and dozens of nations and the dozens of artists who are all represented here, they leave with a new perspective.
Yeah, David, is there a sense of what partnerships we might see develop, in other films or in other ways here at the studios after this?
Well, I would say that we're completely open to it. As I mentioned, we've done screenings in partnership with the Museum of Science and History, with MOSH. Goodnight Oppie was one of the first films we showed as part of this film series. We've done the 30 Days in Mariupol in conjunction with the World Affairs Council. Now this film with the Comer. So we're always talking with our colleagues and partners in the cultural spaces here in Jacksonville, and I'm sure that there will be many more of these to come in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it'll be a great screening. It is July 16th, which is Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Yeah. Doors at 6:30. The film starts at 7.
$1 popcorn. You can't beat it.
Yeah, $1 popcorn, and I think $5 admissions right here at WJCT Studios. All right. Well, Holly Karras, David McGowan, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you for listening. That's our program. You can send feedback or suggestions to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. And if you missed anything today, you can catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight, or you can find our entire archive on
Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Florida Theater presents Dave Koz and Friends, Summer Horns 2025. Performing alongside the jazz saxophonist will be Marcus Anderson, Jeff Bradshaw, Leo P., Evan Taylor, and Marcel Anderson. Saturday, July 19th at 8 p.m. Information at floridatheater.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Next year marks 250 years since the founding of the United States. How have innovations in science, technology, and democracy shaped where we are now? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Jen White. Today on 1A, it's If You Can Keep It, our weekly series on politics and the state of our democracy. Today, a new report gives a timeline of 250 years of American innovation, from bifocals to the cell phone. It also maps innovations in American democracy. And in looking back, it paints a picture of the health of our democracy today. We take a closer look. But first, Friday is the Senate deadline for deliberations on the rescissions package. What sticking points are threatening the future of Trump's spending cuts? It's all coming up after this news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Giles Snyder. President Trump has the war in Ukraine on his agenda. Trump's special envoy to Ukraine arrived in Kyiv today, and NATO Chief Mark Rutte is due at the White House this hour after Trump late yesterday confirmed that the U.S. will use NATO to send Patriot air defense missiles to help Ukraine defend against Russian aerial attacks. All this as Trump is expected to make what he says is a major statement on Russia. NPR's Charles Maines is in Moscow.
The Kremlin is taking a wait-and-see approach, perhaps waiting also to see whether these U.S. arms deliveries through NATO include more offensive weapons that could strike inside Russia. I think they're also curious to see whether Trump includes new sanctions in his announcement today. In that sense, it's been interesting to see Moscow remain fairly deferential to Trump, turning the other cheek, for example, even when Trump has used profane language to call Putin unserious about negotiations.
Trump made ending the war in Ukraine a priority, but has increasingly expressed frustration with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Israel, Hamas continuing talks in Qatar for a ceasefire deal in Gaza. President Trump says he hopes for a deal this week. NPR's Daniel Estrom reports from Tel Aviv, where Israeli officials are discussing a proposal to drive tens of thousands of Palestinians into a new zone in southern Gaza.
A major unresolved issue in the ceasefire talks is Israel's demand to keep troops in a strip of land in order to cordon off a zone in southern Gaza. A person briefed on the matter who spoke on condition of anonymity said Israeli mediators in the talks are presenting maps of proposed troop placements. That is connected to a proposal Israeli officials are discussing to build what they call a humanitarian city in southern Gaza, a large tent camp in an area guarded by soldiers to separate civilians from Hamas. A UN official says that would amount to mass displacement into, quote, concentration camps near the Egyptian border. Daniel Estrin, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
Stocks opened mixed this morning after President Trump threatened higher tariffs on imports from some of the country's biggest trading partners. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 43 points in early trading.
Over the weekend, President Trump said he planned to impose tariffs of 30% on goods coming into the U.S. from both Mexico and the European Union. As with other recent tariff announcements, the effective date for the new levies is August 1st, leaving some wiggle room for adjustment before that. The muted reaction in the stock market so far suggests that investors are doubtful the president will actually follow through on his tariff threats. On Friday, the Treasury Department said the government collected $27 billion in tariff revenue in the month of June. That's 4 times the import taxes the government took in during the same month last year. Asian stocks were mixed overnight, up in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Seoul, but down in Tokyo. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
And from Washington, this is NPR News. Authorities in the Boston area are investigating